Our gospel this morning is Matthew's story about the labourers in the vineyard. And as I was reading it last week, I couldn't help hearing the cry, "It's not fair," echoing through my mind. There are the workers standing around in the marketplace waiting for work. As each group is selected, the ones left behind are thinking, "It's not fair. I'm as good a worker as any one of them. Why not pick me?" And then when it's time for payment, the men chosen first grumbled that the last group were paid the same wage as them. Definitely not fair. So what's Jesus saying to us here? That life isn't fair and we need to learn to accept it with good grace? No, I don't think so either. It's both simpler and more complicated than that. First of all, the story of the labourers in the vineyard is timeless. It speaks to every generation in which people are desperate and unemployed, hanging around marketplaces and street corners waiting for work. It speaks to concern for the poor and the outcast and for social justice. Now, I didn't know my paternal grandfather that well, but when he was working, he was a steel turner on Clydeside. It's the when which is the important part of his story. He would undoubtedly have been one of those waiting from early morning to be picked for a day's work. Just as skilled, just as quick, just as eager as everybody else. So it can't have been easy to be the one left behind, to be the one waiting with ever-decreasing confidence for something else to come along, till at last there was nothing else to do. Go back to your wife and 3 children, with only your hands in your pockets. Not fair. As an aside, my gran could make a pot of soup last a week. That was what she learned from that time. And that wasn't fair either. Did my grandfather and his friends begrudge the people who got work? I'm sure there were times when they did. But it could be their turn tomorrow, and they would be standing again at the dockyard gates, not giving up, hoping for a day's work, hoping for a day's pay, hoping that life would be fair, hoping to be able to feed their families that night, hoping for hope. And out of those times, we tell modern-day parables about ministers like George MacLeod, the founder of the Iona community, who took men out of government to help rebuild Iona Abbey, and along the way, help them to rebuild their self-esteem, their sense of hope and self-worth. And about the politicians on both sides of the spectrum who tried to build a fairer world. But we haven't got there yet. There is still work to be done. And despite what we sometimes fear, there are still people doing it. But how many people, I wonder, saw those would-be, want-to-be labourers waiting in the marketplace and just kept on going? How many of them could have done something if they'd thought about it? How many just saw an amorphous mass, not people at all? But how many saw brothers, children of Abraham, to go back to our gospel of a couple of weeks ago? And then there's the landowner. He hires the men he needs to get the work done, rather than demanding more of the ones he found first. He paid everyone the same daily wage because he knew it was just as hard standing around bearing the burden of the day and the scorching heat, waiting for work, as it was being gainfully employed in a vineyard. Who paid men not just with denarii, but with self-respect and the knowledge that there is fairness in the world. Who paid with grace and generosity of spirit, because he saw every worker as a child of Abraham and worthy of God's love. Who paid with hope. This isn't the only time in the Gospels we hear Jesus say that the last will be first and the first will be last. He means it. It also comes at the end of Mark's story of the rich young man, and in Luke's story about the tax collector and the Pharisee. There it says, all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. Same basic idea. And I know you can think of other stories too. Stories in which Jesus' hearers see the natural order of things being overturned because God chooses love, generosity, and hope over playing it safe and sticking to the status quo. Of course, you don't just have to read this parable in terms of social and economic justice. Those were the ideas which struck me last week, but there are other equally valid interpretations. For example, Matthew was writing for a mixed congregation of Jews and Gentiles, so you can read this in the light of the arguments about welcoming Gentiles into faith, arguments which are repeated in Acts and the Epistles, and which still rumble on in some communities today. You can read it in the light of the possible relationships between the first disciples and those who joined them after Pentecost. We did all the hard work, following him across hundreds of miles of desert. My feet weren't like this when I started. How can Jesus love the new convert as much as he loved the people who were with him from the beginning? Or you can read it in the light of the parable of the prodigal son and see the elder brother as the first of the labourers and the younger son as the last, both loved equally by their father. Or if you're really theologically minded, try reading it in the context of the argument about faith and works. See where that takes you. Or just think about it next time you hear a complaint about those who do all the work and those who do nothing but still get the credit. There are still a lot of "it's not fair" cries to be heard. God must be used to it by now. But whatever way you look at this story, it must always be through the prism of the hope we all have in Christ. In this story, timeless story, the model is always the same. God doesn't play by our rules, doesn't judge the way we do, doesn't play favourites. We are all loved and more than we deserve. That's God's gift and God's grace. And in return, God challenges us to look into our hearts, to think, really think about what we're doing and why. Do we act out of love and gratitude, ideas in last week's gospel, or just from a desire to look good, or bearing in mind that this is Matthew we're reading, acting from a desire to avoid punishment? As we learn to know God and ourselves a little better, can we begin to let go of "it's not fair" and trust in God's unfailing love? I think maybe we can all hope for that. Amen.